Perfectionist Musicians Podcast. Take action to find healthy perfectionism. Discussions about the background of successful careers in music performance, arts and science.
Hello everyone, it's been a long time since the last Perfectionist episode was released. Basically, years have passed since actually I talked to you here on my channel. During that time, during these 3 years, I became a full-time lecturer of applied psychology and communications at ELTE, Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest in Hungary. And also it happened that, inspired by a series of works and opportunities which I had in these last 3 years, such as presenting at a conference on musicians' health, and also I helped out professional musicians and music students to lead a healthier, happier, and more effective musical practices. I was basically mentoring and coaching these musicians, and I received a lot of feedback and lots of insights into their day-to-day activities and the mindsets. And also I heard lots of questions and insecurities. So after all, I initiated a new piece of research at my university, which I decided to link together with the podcast. And this research basically offers publicly accessible interviews with classically trained musicians that you, as practicing musicians, you can have an insight into the highly experienced musicians' stories of their musical learning, how they built their careers, how they built and acquired professional skills and knowledge, which is basically required for running successful musical careers. So this episode today with Shoebridge, Alexander technique teacher and musician's health specialist, is the last episode of the old series, and the new series of the Perfectionist podcast will start soon after, in which a new episode will be released every week, featuring guests as highly experienced singers and instrumentalists. For instance, Chris Broughton, first baritone of the King Singers, Florian Mitra, professor of piano and ensemble coach at the Royal Academy of Music in London, and for instance also Dag Anders Eriksson, first violin tutti at Bergen Philharmonic Orchestra. And these were just some of the names from the English-speaking interviewees. Also, I'm going to release interviews in Hungarian language as well. For instance, with Eva Dulfalvi, who is second violin section leader at the Hungarian National Philharmonic in Budapest in Hungary. Many of these interviews have already been recorded, and some of the stories were deeply moving and even shocking for me. So based on this, I truly believe that these seasoned artists and amazing human beings can share really something with you as well that you will find beneficial and useful for your own growth and learning, and basically building your careers in the music performance field. In the meantime, I need to say that it's your time also to ask questions from these established musicians, these artists. So before the interviews I'm going to record with the artists in the near future, I also invite you to share your questions, suggestions, any topics that you would like to ask these established and mainly experienced music performers. So for this, we organize a group discussion online or in person, depending on where you are. And you can be a performing master student, or you can be a young music professional. So basically, if you have questions or if you have suggestions whom you like to get interviewed, so please get in touch with me, and I really appreciate if I can have a short discussion together with some other young artists So how long does it take and where is it happening? These focus group sessions, these group interviews, which will not be public, don't worry about that. So the planned length of the informal group discussions is about 1 hour, but can be shorter or longer depending on basically you as a group. The possible form of the conversation is online, as I said, or in person. If you are in Budapest, if you are located in Budapest, you can come and we can do it in Hungarian, or if you're from abroad, of course, you can invite your other musician friends and we can do it in English as well. So don't worry, these will not be published anywhere, as these will be just the kind of information for the public interviews. So, needless to say that your contribution is also highly appreciated. And here is again the time and space for you to raise your attention. And if you are interested, feel free to get in touch with me by emailing to emese@perfectionist.org, like actionist with an A, like, take action to fight healthy perfectionism. And in my reply email, I'm going to sending you further information regarding the participation. And now, after sharing all this with you, now let's get to the interview with Anne Shoebridge, a lovely lady from Australia, Alexander Technique, and musician's health specialist.
Perfectionist Musicians Podcast. Take action to find healthy perfectionism. Discussions about the background of successful careers in music performance, arts and science.
Before each podcast episode, I usually introduce my guest. This time, I'd like to act in a similar fashion. Anne Shoebridge is a musician's health specialist, currently works in the area of musicians' health and performance at the University of Melbourne. She teaches undergraduate and postgraduate music students Alexander Technique for performance and health. Also, she teaches on professional symphony orchestra fellowship programs, as well as pre-professional, school student, and amateur musicians and actors. Anne is highly experienced as a physiotherapist. She completed her degree in 1980, and she's also very experienced as an Alexander Technique teacher. She gained her AT teacher certificate in 1989. From an initial interest in neurology and pain management, Anne has developed particular expertise in well-being and performance for musicians and actors, and completed her doctorate in musicians' health. In case you are not familiar with the Alexander Technique, I am going to share very brief information as a summary about AT. So AT helps performers to access the mind-body or psychophysical coordination. Basically, AT provides a means to enhance authentic and focused performance and to avoid problems caused by excessive tension, poor posture, or entrenched habits. In the interview, Anne shared her views and observations of musicians about the internal circumstances which may increase the risk of injury and, of course, anxiety. You will learn from the interview that it is quite common that musicians suffer of musculoskeletal issues. For instance, she shared the research results. She talked about research results that players of asymmetrical instruments may experience physiological problems more often than players of the symmetrical instruments. She reported about one research study that singers had the highest prevalence of performance-related pain. That was utterly surprising for me, and she was also surprised. So this information and all sorts of other useful ideas and observations will be available in this interview, so please welcome Anne Shoebridge. I wanted to ask you that how much are musicians aware of their problems?
It's a really good question. I think, and it depends on where we're talking as well. So I would think in some city places now that people are getting more aware at a younger age, but I'd say that it's at school age, they're generally not. At university, they're starting to wake up because there are health programs beginning to come into the universities, but still a lot in Australia don't have anything at all. And professional musicians who are working in an orchestral setting learn about it generally because they've got occupational health and safety training. But many others don't. People who play in some sort of contemporary music bands, different kinds of ensembles, are just sort of, they're playing at a professional level, but they're not. It's not necessarily where they earn their major income. And many of those people know that they have trouble, but they don't know how common the trouble is, and so it's not normalised, and that makes it much more difficult even to seek help or to put in place the sort of strategies that people need to get somewhere. Yeah.
Do you mean that they are not aware of how common the issue is? That do they think that it's only them, or it's very rare, and so therefore they don't seek help?
Yeah, I think that very often they think it's just them. So there's that, or they think it's kind of an aberration. People who are younger think, if I ignore it, it'll go away. That is often something that happens. When they're older, there's still a problem with getting professional musician positions is very competitive, and people are worried that if they're known or seen to have some kind of impediment or injury, that they won't get that job, if it's between them and someone that doesn't have it. So
professional musicians tend to hide their issues in front of their leaders and bosses and conductors and managers.
And their peers, I think, very often. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and not only professional, but also pre-professional.
What are the most common issues that you notice in your practice?
Well, pain is by far the most common symptom. The distribution is a bit instrument related, yes. So for people who support their instrument on the thumb, for example, are more likely to have thumb pain than somebody that doesn't. Upper string players very often have left shoulder, left neck pain because of working too hard to support the instrument. Lower string instruments players tend to have back pain quite often for various reasons. Lugging instruments around is one of them. The way they sit's another one. The way they lean over the instrument to play sometimes. But there's a lot of stuff around, or literature around, about, well, if you play an asymmetrical instrument, then that's going to be more problematic than playing a symmetrical instrument. But there's a fairly recent study done by the British group. It's headed up by somebody called Kruder, who found that they looked at symmetrical instruments, asymmetrical instruments, and singers had the highest prevalence of performance-related pain.
Wow.
And they don't even hold an instrument.
That's surprising for me.
Yeah, that's right. And there was no significant difference between the symmetrical and asymmetrical. See, pianists have just as much pain as anyone else, and they don't hold their instrument. So then the question is, why? What is it that's causing that?
Do you have any guesses?
Well, I mean, you touched on this in the questions that you sent me. You asked about perfectionism and about psychological factors. And there's a multiplicity of factors that come together to create pain. So one of the sort of common traits in musicians who are performing at a high level is having very high self-expectations. So, which is another way of saying perfectionism. And I was actually talking to a friend earlier in the day whose father was a very famous recorder maker and a wonderful musician, and she's also a very accomplished musician. And she was saying, well, perfectionism has its upside because it makes us strive for the best we can possibly be all the time. But it just has this really, feisty downside, which means that we can push ourselves so hard that it's beyond what's constructive for our health, but also for good achievement. So when I'm teaching, I teach every year into training programs for professional orchestras in Australia. And I get a group of people who are being mentored by musicians in the orchestra, and they get to work with me as well during this training program. And I talk to them about optimal learning conditions because they have a lot of notes to learn. They have a mock audition at the beginning of the week, and then they have a casual audition at the end of the week to get into the orchestra. So they're working very, very hard during that week. It's really pressured, it's competitive, and it's at their highest level. And really, they're going to learn quicker and maintain a better mental and physical condition if they do focus practice. For example, they set a goal for 20 minutes, a clear goal about what they want to achieve in that time. They set an alarm, they play for 20 minutes, they stop for 10. And they don't then play on the computer or do something else with, or the phone, something else with a keyboard, or, similar movement of the small muscles. They either lie down on the floor or, lie down, go out, or cleaning. We've got lots of windows, so I clean the windows in between. It's a completely different activity. It gives your brain a rest. And the thing is that you don't learn well in an anxious state. You learn much better at the other end of the parasympathetic sympathetic spectrum. So the autonomic nervous system, one end is fight and flight, the other one's rest and digest. If you're too far up the fight and flight end, you don't learn well, and you don't perform that well either. So what you want to do is to just give yourself time to absorb, think about, refocus, and then plan the next interval that you're learning stuff, and then do the same again. And I advise people every 3 cycles of learning that they have a half-hour break. Now that seems really excessive, but I know from my own research that if you break for less than 10 minutes, it has the same physiological effect as if you didn't take a break at all. So it doesn't give you any recovery time. It also doesn't give your brain any downtime to digest what you've just done. And if you take a half-hour break, I'm talking from memory here, but I think the figures are that you're a fifth as likely to report injury.
So increase your chances not to get an injury by 80%. Fifth, you said fifth.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, you increase your chances of not getting an injury by 80%. I have to be careful here because we don't know what direction causation is. So we don't know what the relationship, there's an association between breaks and not reporting injury, but we don't know exactly what it is. However, that's how it seems to be. So I think it's a combination. If you feel like you're achieving something, if you can see that you're achieving something rather than just in a panic and pushing and feeling worse and worse and worse, then you stay in a better state. The other thing is that if you're pushing, you don't generally stop breathing as well. So physiologically, you just don't stay in as good condition as if you take proper breaks. And on one of these training programs, well, very often people are playing injured when they come into the program, actually. And one really terrific bass player was playing injured. He had a very good chance of winning the audition anyway, but he was a terrific bass player, but he was playing in pain. And he did as I advised him to do, exactly. So, but for starters, he only played for 10 minutes and took a 10-minute break because I told him that he shouldn't play for longer than 10 minutes if he was sore. So, but because of taking those breaks, his pain settled down, and then he was able to build up the time. But he kept taking 10-minute break after 20 minutes, and on the third cycle taking a half-hour break. And his pain improved over the week, and he learned everything as well as he needed to learn it and played as well as he wanted to play. So it's psychophysical. It's not just physical and it's not just mental. It's a whole mix. There's a woman called Jessica Stanhope who's done what's called a mapping review, which is a big review of all the literature in musicians' health. And she's got an enormous list of risk factors, possible risk factors, and they're sort of, they might be work related. So that's things like repertoire, if the repertoire is too difficult, or, sometimes it's the scheduling of it. So if you're playing very difficult repertoire over a long period of time, that's going to affect you adversely. So, without proper breaks or long enough to learn it properly. It might be emotional dynamics in the ensemble. It might be the way the orchestra is set up. It might be your rehearsal scheduling. It might be the seating. So there's all those sort of environmental factors that can play a part. And then there's sort of the intrinsic factors, the things that you have control over in your own body, like the amount of muscle tension you play with and how you manage your own practice time, how you relate to the people around you. One of the things that came up in my study was ensemble dynamics. And I was reading another study recently by a woman called Megan Waters from Brisbane, who did a lovely 5-year study on violin students going through the university. And one of the big things they talked about was orchestra, how difficult orchestra was for a whole lot of reasons. So I think what we're looking at is a really complex set of factors, and you need to be cognizant of those, aware of them, and working with them constructively. Taking into account things like, the work, occupational health literature, one of the biggest influences on workplace health is the attitude of the employers, the kind of culture they nurture.
Based on your practice, not just the literature, what's the reality? What have you observed?
Well, we have an Australian Institute of Sport, and athletes, if they go through a big competition, they have massages and time off and time in the spa and all that sort of stuff. Well, musicians do a big gig, a huge concert, and they're back rehearsing the next day for the next one. That's what really happens. So I think musicians also tend to think that more is better. Hour after hour after hour of practice, more is better. And in fact, quite a long time ago now, again, sort of backing up what I'm saying, there was some work done showing that of course you need to practice. There's no doubt about that. But the thing that really distinguishes between two people who've done the same amount of practice is focused practice, is thoughtful practice. And you can walk down the corridors at the university and tell that probably 95% of the people behind those doors playing are not thinking about what they're doing. They're just playing by rote. They're not playing music, they're playing notes. So that actually, if that's how you practice, that's actually not how you want to perform. So what you want to do is play the way you want to perform, because that's how you set your wiring up properly, your internal wiring.
So what would be the solution? I know that you apply Alexander technique to musicians.
I do.
How does it help, and what else can be applied?
So how it helps is it really teaches people how to use themselves most efficiently within the context that they're working. So instead of kind of having an argument with their body or their instrument or the fact that they're playing in a stressful circumstance, they can work to make all those things work in their favour in a coordinated way. So in terms of physicality, what we want to do is coordinate postural support, breathing and movement. See, most people have an understanding of this, but I say to musicians, okay, what's good posture? Because so many people go, oh, my posture's a problem. And they say, well, it has to be dynamic and responsive and flexible and all the rest of it. And then I say, well, show me good posture. And then they sit up straight and they jam themselves. So it's about learning how to be able to be dynamic through the whole body, be in a state of dynamic poise, really, so that the music gets from where it starts within you, in your heart and mind, out through the instrument to the audience with the least possible interference. That's what we want. That's what everyone wants. Communication is what it's about. So that is my primary aim, because in that, the musicians I work with and I are fully aligned with that as a goal. And then the second thing that it can do, because you play with a better distribution of effort, then the perceived effort is less. So most musicians who have Alexander lessons can play with less, feel like they play with less effort, and therefore it's more pleasurable. And then the third thing it can do, because it tends to reduce unnecessary muscle tension, is that potentially reduces the amount of injuries. So it's an educational process that really has therapeutic side effects.
So to me, I can imagine it works that musicians practice a lot because they think that the quantity matters, and I read a lot of stuff that musicians feel guilty when they didn't do up to the hours they planned. So it's an emotional struggles working in the background. So that causes, of course, tension. I know from myself.
Yep.
That increases the chances of getting injured anyway. Practicing a lot increases the chance of getting injured. And for me, it comes across like you say, you want to calm musicians down that, look, you don't need to practice in a way how you did. This is a better form, this easier form, and be sure that you do this way. And because these musicians are told how to practice, they trust your advice, or they trust the expert's advice. So they are calm, though they're not stressed, because they don't doubt themselves anymore. They trust the method they were told to do and follow. So releases them a lot of tension.
I think what you say is right, but they only learn to trust by trying it and then seeing that it works.
So they don't trust you straight away.
Of course not. Why would they? So I did have someone walk into one of these programs to his private lesson with me and look at me. I'm quite short, so he looked down at me and he said, well, I'm already a very good musician, so why should I listen to you? And I said to him, that's a really good question. And the only reason you should listen to me is if I have something worthwhile saying. So would you like to have a go at this, or would you like to spend your time practicing and send someone else in? And he had a go. He was a wind player. He said, oh, no, I'll have a go. So good on him for that. And he wasn't using about the lower third of his thorax nearly as efficiently as he could have. So it just wasn't expanding anything like as well as it could. He responded beautifully and ended up with a whole lot more air. He was thrilled. So just part of my job is identifying the things that are getting in the way for people. What's stopping you from being able to play your instrument in the best possible way for you in the circumstances under which you're playing? We're just getting rid of what's in the way.
I'm trying to distillate the meaning of and the benefits of getting help. That just speaking just from my own experience, when I'm in my own thoughts and I don't realize that actually other people struggle with the same stuff, like self-doubt, blah, 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 low confidence levels. And when a bunch of people come together and we dare to share these issues. And actually that's the reason actually I started this podcast, because you just started talking to me about that musicians don't even share with their peers.
Not necessarily.
This is a taboo. No. And I would like to break this taboo and show musicians that this is normal and there's help offered, and they just need to go out and get help. And it's not something to be ashamed about.
No, absolutely not. We have to create a culture where it's understood that musicians are athletes of the small muscles. And we need to treat the physical side of playing with as much seriousness as we treat the physical side of sport. But with musicians, there are a different set of complexities because of the different set of demands that are on them. It means that it's very important for musicians who seek help to seek help from people who understand what musicians need to do. Because if they go, for example, to a hand therapist, then the hand therapist might be quite happy with the way that their hands rehabilitated after, a fracture or whatever, but it's no good for playing the violin or the piano. So they really need to go to somebody who understands what the demands of playing involve and have the tools to be able to help them back to where they need to go.
How can a musician find out which therapist is the best for their issues? Because there's lots of services offered.
There are, yeah. Well, there are the international organisations in performing arts medicine. So the sort of the umbrella organisation is the Performing Arts Medicine Association in the United States, and the British one is British Association for Performing Arts Medicine. And they operate very differently. They operate from different models, but what they do offer is advice and a network of professionals who do work with musicians. So that's a place to start. The other place is to go, if there was no one around, if you're suffering from pain or discomfort and there's no one around that that you can ask about it, I would actually go to a university faculty and ask them if they know of people who've worked successfully with musicians in the faculty.
And what about those musicians
yes.
who are not living in English-speaking countries?
Well, because it's an international network, I'd probably still contact PAMA. If there's no organisation in your country, I'd contact PAMA to see if they have people in Hungary or, wherever your non-English speaking country is. And then I think I would go to perhaps a professional orchestra and ask them if they have people who work with them. So essentially trying to penetrate a network of musicians that may have already had good experience of practitioners.
So you said that even though someone is not part of a professional orchestra, just approach the orchestra and ask whether they can recommend anyone.
Yeah, I would. I think the difficulty with healthcare is, you can always go to a healthcare practitioner and say, do you work with musicians or can you work with musicians? If they say yes, that's fine, but it's really good to get a recommendation from somebody who's in the area, who's had experience of successful treatment from someone or someone's.
And what about, I know that you mostly deal with the physiological issues, but what if someone has more psychological issue, like very high performance anxiety? Is it the same case? Do they need to approach these international organizations, or how can we follow the gut feeling to, there are lots of services, psychologists, counselors. What would be the best technique to find the right counselor or specialist?
It's such a good question. The thing is that performance psychology is a whole area, it's a whole discipline in itself. So you could try finding a performance psychologist. But I think counselling is a very tricky thing. I think you need to try people out. You need to try your health practitioners out, actually, counsellors or physical health practitioners. And if you're not getting what you went for, then don't go back. You of course you need to discuss it with your practitioner. Is this what you'd expect to be happening? How do you expect this to unfold? But really what you're doing is buying a service. And that service needs to meet your needs. And if it's not meeting your needs, then you need to look elsewhere. I think it's very important not to becoming a passive recipient of a service that's not doing you any good.
And I had a question prepared, and you know about that. Actually, when you and me met last year at the International Symposium on Performance Science in Melbourne, You
Yes.
mentioned exercises and games which you have developed yourself to help musicians and actors. And I'm really, really curious about these and what are
There's
these
the
and how does
games.
it work?
Well, when I run a workshop, I can't work with my hands with everybody for any length of time, of course, because when the way that I teach Alexander technique, not all teachers, but many in the world, we teach by giving verbal instructions, but we also use our hands on people, in contact with people. And our hands do two things. They pick up information about how you move and balance your body against gravity, and they give you information about how you might do that better. So obviously when you're working with a group, you can't do that. So I do some really simple things. I teach the principles of the technique, which are about undoing excessive tension, about just moving a little into more space. So really simple example. So you and anyone who's listening to this podcast can do it right now, as you're just presumably going to be sitting or lying mostly, or if you're standing, it doesn't make any difference. So we're all very familiar with the concepts of weight and gravity, which are both down. You know, we know our weight goes down, right? So what we're way less aware of, and so the brain doesn't take hold of as much, I think, is the fact that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So we've got weight going down, but we've got support coming up. We have an anti-gravity mechanism that takes us up if we can access it and not interfere with it too much. So if you just, for a moment, be conscious of your weight sort of dropping down over your bones into the supporting surface, and you can feel your bottom against the chair, you can feel your feet against the floor, but now feel the floor against your feet and the chair against your bottom, and think of it coming up through you. And respond to that support you've got just by lightening up a little through your whole structure. And think about letting your back widen to breathe. So your ribs moving to breathe. So you may not have felt anything because it's such a small thing. But you may have felt, and people often feel, just an opening up, just a little bit of a lightening through the whole structure. And really that's what we're wanting to achieve, a lightening up, improvement in the breathing, easier postural support, and then taking that into activity. So I teach those things, and then I'll do something like I'll run a relay. Not necessarily with musicians, but I'll do this with actors because they're very aware of their body being there. You know, it's actually physical acting as a subject. So I'll divide them into two teams. I'll get them to run a relay. They have their own timers, timing the teams for speed, and I just get them to run as fast as they can, and they get timed. And then the second time, I'll get them just to think about how they do it. So the directions that I've given them as to the way they use their bodies. So before they begin freeing up, especially through the neck and head, and basically lengthening and expanding in order to run. And then the third time I get them to do that in order to run fast. And they peel remarkable seconds off the time. But not only do they do that, they feel like they're going slower. So when you're able to create a bit more length and breadth in yourself and a good breathing pattern, one of the interesting side effects is that you can speed up, but you feel like you've got more space and time. That's a very useful thing to have when you're playing fast passages.
I just wanted to reflect on this regarding musicians. When I was learning Hungarian folk dances, there are lots of regions which have very complicated figures and steps and spinning. And
Yep.
when the music was speeding up, the dance teacher said that actually you think you have to do it slower, then you will be able to do it. And
Yeah.
when I was playing the violin, I felt the same. When I forced myself to play fast, that it wasn't nice to listen to. That was really horrible.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
when I just played with not really much effort, just freely,
Yeah, freely.
then it was much nicer to listen to.
That's right. But the question is, how do you do that? You know, what are the strategies that you can put into place when you're scared stiff because you've got a huge audience in front of you, or when you have to learn that really fast passage really quickly, you need a strategy for still being able to play freely. So what I do is I teach people to free up physically as they approach those passages, because you can generally tell the passages are coming just by looking at the person, because they tense up before they get there. So the thing is to have that, to learn it mentally. You know what this music sounds like. You know exactly how you want it to sound. Now free up so you can let your body do that. It sounds terribly, terribly simple to the point of being trite. And it is simple. It sometimes can feel elusive, but it can be remarkable. If you can untie your physical responses from your mental responses, because if you feel nervous about something that's coming up, you're going to have a physiological response that can really reinforce that. If you have the tools to be able to do something else in that moment, then it can really give you something to change how that plays out.
So for me, the core is exactly that: keep calm. So focus on just taking it naturally, doing it naturally. Try to keep calm. Try it out.
I don't think so. I
No?
think keeping calm is an outcome. I don't think it's a process.
Okay, so what's the process exactly?
The process exactly, unfortunately, doesn't make a lot of sense when I say it. It only makes a lot of sense when you experience it. So the process begins with freeing up the neck and head area, particularly, so that you're not pulling your head down on top of your whole structure. So your whole spine can just lengthen a little bit, even a tiny bit, and give you space to breathe. That's what you're doing. It takes a long time to say all that, but to do it is only a split second's work. You know, it's a kinesthetic visualization, really. You can do that even in a very short rest in the music. You can just quickly free up again and then go on. So the thing is, you've got a job to do. What's the job? Well, the job is to communicate this music to this audience. That's the job. It's the only reason you're there. Yeah. So what you need to be able to do is to free up so that you can get on with the job. Trying to keep calm won't do it. By actually telling yourself to release, especially around the neck area. It's like the neck area is a great sort of central place. But this is the thing, this is why it takes a little while to teach, because I'll be there saying, yes, that's it. You know, when you do that, or when you think that thought, that's when your muscles in your back and neck release. That's when you lengthen and widen a bit. That's where you breathe. And mostly people can feel it. They can certainly hear the difference when they play. Sometimes they can see and hear it in others, but they can't see it and hear it in themselves, which is interesting. That's one of the values of working in a group. But your body or yourself will do what yourself tells yourself to do. That's how you do everything. Just right now you're sitting there, you know, nodding at what I'm doing, because your brain, or you are telling yourself to do that. Most of it's unconscious. If you didn't want to listen to me anymore, well, then you would do something else, block your ears or switch the sound off or something like that. What we don't notice is that connection between our intention and our action. And these small actions within our bodies change with intention, just like any other normal movement that we do. The thing is, when we're playing, there's so much else going on. There's the music, there's the expectations, there's the audience, there's the unfamiliarity of the room, all of that stuff. So there's a lot of information that your brain's being bombarded with. And it doesn't feel like something as small as, I think I'll just soften my neck now so that I can come back to this music in this moment. It doesn't feel like that's going to do anything. But when you do it, it changes everything.
That sounds very inspiring. And I think this is a kind of message we can leave for the listeners.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine. Can I just finish with a little story there with that one?
Please.
There's a friend of mine who is a very, very fine musician, and he's of a caliber that people compose for him particularly. And one time a composition had been made for him, but he'd never gotten to perform it while the man was alive. And the composer was a friend of his, and the composer died. And the first time my friend played this was at this composer's funeral in front of his family and all the musical glitterati from around the place. And he said he was overcome with emotion because of his friend's death. He was incredibly regretful because he hadn't played it while the man was alive. And he was a bit intimidated by the massive audience. And he said, all I did was I just kept on freeing up and coming back to the music, freeing up, coming back to the music, freeing up, coming back to the music. And he said, really, in the moment, I didn't have any sense but that. But afterwards, everyone just came up and said how amazing it was. So I think it's so easy to confuse how we feel with the product we produce.
Also, how you describe the whole process he was doing, because he was concentrating on the best possible advice he could follow, what to do to keep the process under control. His mental space didn't allow him to concentrate on his doubts and disturbing thoughts.
Precisely. So people, after having this work, quite often say they feel more grounded, they feel more settled, they're more centered, so they're less distracted, less pulled aside by all of those thoughts that do come in if you let them. Yeah, you have to have another thing going that is actually about the job, is louder than all the other thoughts.
Yeah, if listeners would see me, I'm just nodding very heavily.
You are. Vehement nodding, that's what it is. Well, there's a one podcast called Cautionary Tales that I listen to, and it weaves sort of historical, real stories in with the present. And one of the stories is about a music producer called Brian Eno, who's worked with the likes of people like David Bowie and Prince, very, very famous people. And one of his things to do to really make amazing recordings is to distract people, to really discombobulate them, to put things in the way that takes them entirely out of their comfort zone. So he has during a recording, producing an album, he'll have a set of cards and you have to pick one at random and then just do what it says regardless. So it might say, change places with the guitarist. So the drummer might end up playing guitar and the guitarist plays the drums, or highlight all the mistakes. Or I think from memory, he did something diabolical like bringing a python in and it came across the floor, a snake during the rehearsal. And what happens is that the musicians detest it because it completely puts them into a state of disarray. But they perform really, really well because they're live. They're totally live. It's so easy to... Yeah, I think David Bowie talks on this podcast. I think it was David Bowie who was talking about it, saying he's really good because it's so easy to get into a comfort zone as a musician, or into a zone, into a zone where you're not live. And this just pulls you right out of it. And so some of those, the reason that people get him to do their music producing is because those things are some of their best recordings when they were the most uncomfortable. So he goes on to talk about other examples where people are less comfortable in their subjective senses they haven't done very well, and the people who've been able to stay in their comfort zones feel more comfortable and think they've done really well, but the actual results say something different. Fascinating,
I'm just trying to imagine that. How can this work in the orchestra? Maybe great conductors do something like that, and not with their snake, but just doing something surprising or too kind.
Well, or, even Richard Tognetti, who heads up the Australian Chamber Orchestra, which is just a marvellous orchestra. It's just, the music just breathes. It's so lively all the time. It's wonderful in the best possible way. His violinists and violas stand to play. It's one of the first things he did. They have to move. They can't just stay still. So even that physicality changes it. The culture of interest, the culture of joy, the culture of
freedom of movement and freedom of the mind.
Yeah,
and to feel
exactly.
related, to feel involved.
Yeah, exactly. And ownership, all of that.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, what we're talking about is a really refined discipline. So in some ways, there are very, very clear parameters and restrictions that people are working with all the time. But it's creating the movement within that. And that absolutely beautifully describes the body as well. This is another story. At one point, I had someone who was studying honours, came for his Alexander lesson, first lesson. And I always get musicians to play for me first because that's what they're there for and I want to see how they're doing. He played for me and I looked at him and I said, "So why are you studying music? Why are you doing this?" And he just looked back at me, puzzled. And I said to him, "Presumably you passed the point of doing because your parents want you to. Why did you choose to study music?" And he said, "Because I loved it." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "I'd forgotten." And I said to him, long after you leave university, long after you've forgotten the specific instructions that you've been given while you're there, it's your music. It's not anybody else's. So what you need to do is take all of the advice you're given. Of course, you have to pass, but in the long run, choose what you want, discard the rest, and just remember that it's your music. And your homework is not to play anything you don't like for a week. Well, he came back, he was completely different because the first thing that needed to happen was he had to reclaim his music, because the thing that was getting in the way is that it had become completely deadened because he'd been overwhelmed by what everybody else was telling him and he no longer owned it. And if you don't own it, then you can't work with it.
Ownership from the perspective of self-determination theory sounds a little bit to me like having the sense of competence and autonomy.
Well, I don't know about competency. To me, that's a dangerous thing because mostly people don't feel competent. Some do, but not the majority.
But that's not good. It's not satisfactory.
Well, it just needs to become irrelevant. I think if I waited until I felt competent to do anything, I'd spend all day in bed. I think it's more, the question isn't, am I competent to do it or I have to do it, is do I want to do it? That's the real question. That's the question that has to be answered. And quite a lot of the time it's, do you want to do this audition? Do you want to be here? Someone I spoke to on one of these training programs, she was so, again, it was deadened. She wasn't live in it. And I said to her, "Do you actually want to be here? These are really highly selective programs." And she looked at me and she said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, figure it out." Because that's going to dictate how you manage this week. What do you want to get out of it? And so she figured it out by the next session that she did want to be there, but it wasn't for the reasons that perhaps some of the people around her thought she should be there. So once she was able to establish that, then she could make her own path through it. So I think there's self-efficacy, which is a different thing, but it's the first time I went to work for a professional orchestra, part of me was saying, who do you think you are that you can go in and offer these people something that's going to be worthwhile for them? You can't play anything at the level that they play, nothing like it. And I thought, do I think I've got something to offer? Yes, I do. Do I want to do it? Yes, I do. Have I prepared well for it? Yes, I have. I don't ask myself if I feel like I'm competent because I know what the answer will be, and it's not a useful one. So then the job is, okay, I've done the work. I want to do it. So now I just have to free up and focus. And the very first year I worked on this program, which is now 13 years ago, I just assumed because everyone was so good that they'd all be really confident and have a high sense of competence. And by the end of the week, I realised that they were mostly terrified. And so I bought them each a tiny little wooden doll. And on the last day, I said to them, I bought you a present. And they were just gorgeous. They all looked excited. And I handed these little wooden dolls out and I said, so what you're going to do with these little wooden dolls is that all of the things, all of the stories that you tell yourself that get in the way of you performing your best, you're going to tell the doll and ask them to hold it and leave it outside the door of the audition room. You can pick them up again on the way out.
This is what performance psychologists and trainers do.
Oh, right.
Even sports
Oh, I didn't know that.
psychologists. And this is a funny story. The biggest sports psychologist who founded the whole field in Hungary in the 90s, she works with Olympic gold medalists and she works with beginners, 80-year-old kids. And she said the same, like, she didn't give dolls to work with for the kids. She said, look, your thoughts and disturbing energy and everything which you don't like to take into the hall, you leave it outside, before, in front of the door, outside. And the kid said, oh, that's not far enough because they sneak in under the door. Well, rocket into the moon. And they did it.
Yeah, that's right. And it's because those things just get in the way. It's sort of, it's so easy to get sort of guilt-ridden and go, oh, I shouldn't be thinking this. So it just gets on another tangent
But you're
instead
still
of just
thinking
going,
of it.
yeah, that's right. So it's not that you have to be very clear about what the job is. That's the first thing. You need to get very clear in your head what the job is. So you need to know that music. You need to know how you're playing it in your head and heart.
Actually, what we didn't talk about, but what you said, it sounds to me that one thing is developing your repertoire, mastering the repertoire, and another thing is mastering your skills to present it, to prepare for your presentation, because playing on stage is presenting music.
It is. It really is. And it's very interesting because, we could talk about this for hours, obviously, but one of the things that I noticed when I started attending the auditions was that it was as though the music, that they're in a room, they're maybe 20 feet or, 9 meters or something away, and they're playing, but the music doesn't reach the audition panel. It falls somewhere before it, in the middle of the room. It doesn't get to us. And I thought, what is that? And I realized it's because they were blocking out the audience, trying to pretend they weren't there so that they wouldn't be as nervous. So much of the nervous system is taken up by trying to pretend something that is not real. For one thing, that's a part of themselves that can't be in the music. But for another, it has an effect. If you pretend I'm not here, then you can't play to me. So it's really important that you include in your intent, including during your practice, I'm practicing this music to play to this audience in this context, so that your nervous system is already processing that, so that when you go into the real situation, it's not novel information that you have to process. So I presume that's all in performance psychology as well, is it?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And this is what actually performance coaches try to help with, to teach students to prepare for the audition, for the concert. Thank you so much. And maybe in the future we will continue this talk, because you seem to be highly experienced, and if musicians don't have access to Alexander technique, at least by listening to it and listening to you can be helpful. And we will see anyway what the responses and comments will be after I released it. So
Yeah. Best of luck to everyone who listens to the podcast, and hang in there.
This was the last episode of the first series of the Perfectionist podcast. Please remember that a new series is coming for the summer of 2024 with established and highly experienced classical singers and musicians. Come and join us there as well, and feel free to share your ideas and questions in the comments section, and do get in touch via the Perfectionist website. Thanks for listening, and remember, done is better than perfect.